I was losing my grip on my own kitchen counter, but I was not losing my grip on what was happening in my house. My name is not important. What is important is that I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years driving a delivery route for a logistics company out of Winnipeg. I own a house on a quiet street in the West End that I bought with my first wife back in 1994. And I was being slowly poisoned by my son-in-law in that very house while my daughter watched. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because it took me a long time to sit with it myself. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that is what she is. The person I raised, the person I drove to skating practice at 5:30 in the morning for 6 winters straight. Her name is Stephanie. She is 34 years old. She has her mother's eyes and, as I learned, someone else's heart entirely. Her husband's name is Conrad. He came into our lives about 4 years ago. Smooth the way certain men are smooth. The kind of smooth that feels like charm until you realize there's nothing underneath it. He sold residential real estate in the city. Good at it too. Good at reading people and knowing exactly what they wanted to hear. I should have paid more attention to that particular skill set. My wife, Stephanie's mother, passed away from a stroke in 2019. Carol. 27 years we were together. After she died, the house felt like a museum. Every room had something of hers in it, and for about a year I mostly sat in the kitchen because the kitchen felt the most neutral. It was the room we'd argued in the most somehow, and the arguing had used up whatever tenderness it might have held. I could breathe in there. Stephanie started coming by more after Carol died. I was grateful. I told myself it was grief making us close again, the way grief sometimes does that, pulls people together around the hole someone left. She'd bring food. She'd sit with me. Conrad started coming too, eventually, and when Stephanie suggested they move in to help me out, help at the house, with groceries, just to have someone around, I said yes without hesitating. That was my first mistake, not the biggest, but the first. The first sign that something was wrong with my body was in October, about 14 months after they moved in. I started getting dizzy in the mornings. Not dramatically dizzy, just a soft wobble when I stood up from the table. I figured it was my blood pressure. I'm 63. I've got a history of borderline hypertension. It seemed reasonable. I mentioned it to my doctor at my next checkup and she adjusted one of my medications. It didn't help. By January, I was nauseated almost every morning. Not every morning, maybe 4 days out of 7. Bad enough that I stopped wanting to eat breakfast, which was unusual for me because breakfast had always been the meal I cared about most. Toast with peanut butter. Coffee with 1 sugar. I'd had that breakfast 5 days a week for 20 years. Suddenly it repulsed me. I told myself it was grief still. Late-breaking grief. I'd read somewhere that grief can emerge in the body years after the loss, that the nervous system holds things longer than the mind does. It seemed like a reasonable explanation. I held on to it longer than I should have. What I didn't notice, or didn't let myself notice, was the pattern. I felt worse on the day Stephanie cooked dinner. I don't say that easily. It took me until February to even let the thought form in my head. And when it did, I immediately found reasons to dismiss it. She wasn't cooking anything unusual. She'd always been a decent cook. Nothing fancy. Meat and vegetables, the kind of food we'd always eaten in that house. There was no reason. There was no reason for my own daughter to make me sick. But I am a man who drove a delivery route for 3 decades. I kept mental logs. I noticed patterns without meaning to, because that was how I had survived in that job. You notice which roads ice up first, which loading docks run slow on Fridays, which customers will sign without reading, and which ones will make you wait. You notice. And what I noticed was this: Sunday dinners made me sick. Thursday dinners made me sick. Those were the 2 nights Stephanie cooked while Conrad was out. The 3rd week of February, I poured my Sunday dinner into a Tupperware container while Stephanie was out of the kitchen for a moment. I told her I wasn't hungry, that my stomach was acting up again. She looked at me with what I can only describe as practiced sympathy. Brow furrowed, hand on my arm, the whole performance, and said she hoped I felt better soon. I kept the container in the back of my truck. I didn't do anything with it for almost 2 weeks. Partly because I still couldn't fully believe what I was thinking, partly because I didn't know what to do with that kind of suspicion. You don't call the police and say my daughter might be putting something in my stew, not without something more than a feeling and a Tupperware container of leftovers. What pushed me over the edge was the conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. It was a Tuesday night in early March. I'd gone to bed early because I'd had a bad few days. Weakness in my legs, the kind of exhaustion that sits in your bones. And I woke up around 1 a.m. needing water. The house was quiet and dark, and I walked down the hall in socks without turning on any lights. I don't know why I didn't turn on the lights. Habit, maybe, or some animal instinct that told me to move softly. They were in the kitchen. The light over the stove was on. Just that one light, and they were talking low, but not low enough. Conrad was explaining something. His voice had a patience to it that reminded me of the voice he used when he talked about real estate listings, calm and methodical, like he was walking someone through numbers that had already been decided. He said something about the property. He said something about timing. He said my daughter's name twice in the same sentence, which struck me as odd, as if he was reminding her who she was and what she'd agreed to. Stephanie said, "He's getting worse, it's working." I stood in the hallway for I don't know how long. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe 3 minutes. Time moved strangely in that moment. I know that I felt something leave my body, some last holdout of disbelief, the part of me that had still been protecting the version of my daughter who existed before this one. I went back to my room, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought, very clearly, I am not dying of grief. I am not dying of blood pressure. I am being made sick on purpose. And the two people doing it live in my house. And if I don't do something about it carefully and correctly, I am going to lose everything. My house was worth $460,000. I'd bought it for $112,000. In 30 years, the neighborhood had changed considerably. Younger families moved in, old factories got converted, a coffee shop opened on the corner that I'd never actually gone into. The equity in that house was the majority of what I had. My pension from the logistics company was decent, but not grand. There was also Carol's life insurance, which had paid out at $200,000, and which sat in a registered account that I had not touched. Conrad knew all of this. We'd talked about finances more than once, the way you do with family, the way I'd thought he was family. I'd mentioned the insurance, I'd mentioned the account. I had trusted him with the shape of my financial life because he was my daughter's husband, and I thought that meant something. I made myself wait until morning. I made myself act normal through breakfast. I told myself, you do not move until you know exactly what you're doing. I called my brother that afternoon from the parking lot of a Canadian Tire 2 kilometers from the house. My brother lives in Thunder Bay. We don't talk as often as we should, but there are certain phone calls you can only make to a person who knew you before you knew yourself. And this was one of them. I told him what I'd heard. I told him what I'd saved in the Tupperware container. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You need a lawyer, and you need to get that container tested." In that order. He was right. I found a lawyer through a referral from a man I'd worked with for 15 years before he retired. The lawyer's name was Patterson, and she had an office on a high floor downtown, and she listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I was done, she looked at me for a moment and then said, "Do you have somewhere else you can stay while we work through this?" I told her I had my brother. She said, "Go to your brother." But not yet. First, we need to establish something. What she meant was that I needed to be certain. A suspicion and a container of cold stew wasn't enough. What we needed, she explained, was documentation. Ideally, we needed evidence of their intent, paperwork, recordings, something that showed this wasn't accidental, wasn't my imagination, wasn't something Conrad could explain away as innocent. She told me about a surveillance company she'd worked with before, legal residential surveillance, the kind that installs small cameras in places you own, in your own home, with appropriate documentation. In Manitoba, you're permitted to record in spaces you own and occupy. I owned that house. I still occupied it, technically, though increasingly it felt like I was a guest in it. I had the cameras installed on a Thursday when Stephanie and Conrad were both out. 2 in the main living areas, 1 in the kitchen, positioned on the assumption that money conversations happen in kitchens, small things, smaller than I expected. The technician was a woman who worked efficiently and didn't ask unnecessary questions and was gone in under 2 hours. Then I waited. What I saw over the next 3 weeks is something I have gone over many times in my head, the way you go over a car accident, not because you want to, but because your brain won't leave it alone. Conrad had a friend. I knew this friend slightly, had met him twice at family dinners, a man named Philip who also worked in real estate. What I didn't know was how often Philip came to my house while I was upstairs resting. 3 times in 2 weeks. Each time, Conrad spread papers across my kitchen table. My kitchen table. The one Carol and I had bought at a furniture warehouse on Pembina Highway in 2001, and they talked about the property. About my property. There was a buyer lined up. A development company. They were planning to offer somewhere around $420, which was slightly under market, but fast. No conditions, no delays. Conrad had apparently already told someone in a preliminary conversation that the title would be clear within 60 days. My daughter sat at that table during 2 of these meetings. She did not protest. She asked about the timeline. She asked whether they'd need her involved in any paperwork at the transfer stage. She sounded like a person who had been thinking about this for a long time and had arrived at a kind of tired practicality about it. I watched this on a laptop in my bedroom. I watched my daughter ask about paperwork for selling the house she grew up in, while her husband and his associate planned around the question of when I would no longer be in a position to object. I also watched what happened in the kitchen at mealtimes. There's a supplement, I'm not going to name it specifically. The lawyers advised against it. And I'll respect that, but it's available online. It's presented as an herbal product, and in sufficient quantities over a prolonged period, it causes neurological symptoms, fatigue, nausea, cognitive fog, dizziness. In elderly people, in people with existing cardiovascular conditions, it can cause more serious complications. Conrad had a small container of it at the back of the spice cabinet. I watched him open that cabinet. I watched him measure. I watched him stir. I want to be precise here because I think precision matters. I watched my son-in-law poison my food on 4 separate occasions over 12 days of recording, and on 2 of those occasions my daughter was in the kitchen. She didn't add anything herself, but she didn't leave the room either. I took the footage to Patterson. I also took the Tupperware container, which had by now been tested by a private lab, a basic screening. Not a full toxicology, but enough to confirm the presence of the compound. Patterson looked at everything without expression and then said, "This is enough, more than enough. How do you want to proceed?" I thought about that question for a day. What I wanted, at the most animal level, was to walk into that kitchen, put the laptop on the table, and watch their faces. I wanted the moment. I won't pretend I didn't want it, because wanting it was human, and I was trying very hard to stay human through all of this. But Patterson had suggested a different approach, and after a day of thinking I agreed it was better. Here is what we did. I told Stephanie I wanted to go on a short trip. A week up north, I said. I needed air. I needed to clear my head. The winter had been hard. She was warm about it, warmer than she'd been in months, actually, and helped me pack a bag and reminded me to take my blood pressure medication. I watched her remind me to take my medication, and I kept my face completely still. Conrad drove me to the airport. We talked about hockey on the way. He asked if I wanted anything from Tim Hortons before the terminal, and I said no, I was fine. He pulled up to the departures level and said to take care of myself. I said I would. I got out of the car and walked into the terminal and sat down on a bench near the arrivals board for 40 minutes. And then I took a cab to my brother's place where I stayed for the following week. During that week, my brother and I watched the footage coming in from the cameras in real time. Patterson had set up a secure viewer. We watched Conrad and Philip meet twice more at my kitchen table. We watched them on a call with someone who appeared to be from the development company. We watched Conrad walk through the house with a notepad, opening closets, measuring windows, writing things down in a way that told me he had been waiting for this particular week for quite some time. And then, on the 5th day, we watched him go to my filing cabinet in the spare room, the room that used to be Stephanie's bedroom, and take out the folder where I kept the original deed to the house. He photographed it. He spent 11 minutes with it. He was careful. He put it back exactly where he'd found it. Patterson filed everything the following Monday. The police were involved by Wednesday. Because the surveillance was legally obtained and the toxicology was documented and the footage of the deed was unambiguous, things moved with the speed I had not expected. There was a particular officer, I'll call her the detective, who was thorough and who treated me with a directness I appreciated, who did not speak to me as though I were fragile or confused, and who seemed to take a very clear-eyed personal interest in the case. I came back to the house on a Thursday afternoon. Conrad and Stephanie were both home. They had just finished lunch. Conrad was standing at the counter with his phone when I walked in, and the expression that crossed his face in the half-second before he rearranged it is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. It was not quite fear. It was something more specific than fear. It was the expression of a man who had convinced himself of something and has just, in an instant, understood that he was wrong. I sat down at my kitchen table. I said, "I think you should both sit down." Stephanie said, "Dad, when did you get back?" I thought. I said, "Sit down, please." They sat. I put the laptop on the table, and I turned it to face them, and I pressed play. I did not watch the screen. I watched their faces, and what I saw there told me everything I needed to know about who they were and what they had decided, somewhere along the way, that I was worth. Conrad said nothing. He went to color I don't have a word for. He looked at Philip's number in his phone as though he was thinking about calling it, and then seemed to understand that there was no one to call. Stephanie said my name. She said it the way she used to say it when she was small and had broken something and wanted me to fix it. I felt the pull of that. I want you to know I felt it. 29 years of her being my daughter did not simply evaporate in that kitchen. It compressed. It sat in my chest like a stone. But I had spent a week at my brother's house thinking very carefully about what mercy without accountability actually means, about what it teaches, about the fact that my daughter had sat at this table and asked about paperwork and had been in the kitchen when Conrad measured the supplement into my food and had said the words, "He's getting worse. It's working." The detective and her colleague came to the door 11 minutes later. I had timed it. Conrad was charged with administering a noxious substance with intent to cause harm. That's the relevant provision under the Criminal Code of Canada, as well as attempted fraud, given the plan to transfer the property under false pretenses. His lawyer tried several things. None of them worked particularly well, given that we had 12 days of video. Stephanie was charged as an accessory. The Crown debated the extent of her involvement for some time. Her lawyer argued she had been coerced, manipulated, that she hadn't understood the full scope of what Conrad was doing. The footage was not entirely in her favor on this point. She received a conditional sentence and 2 years probation, mandatory counseling. Conrad received 4 years. The development company, as it turned out, had conducted their conversations with Conrad in good faith. They hadn't known the property arrangement was fraudulent, and they stepped back without significant drama once the situation became clear. I still live in the house on the West End. I repainted the spare room this past spring, a light gray that Carol would have approved of. I started going to the coffee shop on the corner. The woman who works there on Tuesday mornings is named something I can never catch properly, but she remembers that I take 1 sugar, and that is enough. My brother came down for 2 weeks in July. We sat in the backyard on the old patio furniture and talked about things we'd been meaning to talk about for 20 years. He said he was proud of me. I told him not to make it a bigger thing than it was. He said it was exactly as big as it was, which was the most brother thing he's ever said to me. Stephanie called once, about 6 months after everything concluded. I let it go to voicemail. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know how it had gotten to where it got. She said she thought about the kitchen table. I have not called her back. I'm not going to tell you what the right thing to do is. I don't know what the right thing to do is. What I know is that I am 63 years old. I woke up this morning and made toast with peanut butter and coffee with 1 sugar, and the house is mine, and I am still here. That has to be enough for now, and most mornings it is. I keep coming back to the spice cabinet. Not to Conrad's face when I pressed play, not to the detective's knock at the door, not even to Stephanie saying my name the way she used to when she was small. I keep coming back to that ordinary cabinet above the stove, the one Carol and I bought at a hardware store the first winter we lived in that house, the one that still has a small scuff on the bottom hinge from the time I installed it wrong and had to do it twice. Conrad had put the container at the back, behind the paprika and the dried oregano. He'd hidden it in plain sight in something I touched every single day, in the most ordinary corner of the most ordinary room. That is what I think about when people ask me if I saw it coming. You don't see it coming because you're not looking for it. You're looking for the life you already have, and that instinct, to trust the shape of your own home, to believe the people at your table are who they've always been. That's not naivety. That is what it means to have built something real. The tragedy is that the same openness that lets you love people also leaves a door unlocked. What saved me wasn't luck. I want to be clear about that. It was the habit of paying attention. The same habit I'd spent 30 years building on a delivery route, noticing which roads ice early, which customers run slow, which patterns don't add up. That kind of thinking doesn't feel like intelligence when you're doing it. It just feels like being awake. But over months of mornings feeling wrong, of Sundays being worse than Wednesdays, something in me kept a quiet tally. I didn't act on it right away. I sat with it. I saved a container of cold stew, and I called a lawyer before I did anything else. Precision over panic. That choice, made on one afternoon in a Canadian Tire parking lot, is the reason I still live in my house. And then there is Stephanie. I have not called her back. I may not. That is not something I've decided cleanly. It sits with me the way certain things sit, without resolution, without a neat answer. What I know is this. The hardest thing I did through all of it was not installing the cameras, not sitting across from Conrad while the footage played, not even watching my daughter in that kitchen. The hardest thing was deciding that loving someone does not require absorbing the consequences of what they choose to do to you. That mercy is not the same as surrender. That a father can grieve his child and still hold a line. I think about the men and women who watched this and recognized something. A son, a daughter, a spouse, a slow accumulation of things that didn't quite add up. I think about what it costs to stay awake to those patterns when every instinct tells you to explain them away. It costs something real, but the alternative costs more. The house is mine, the kitchen table is mine, the morning is mine. That has to be enough, and most days it is.